quarters in that thing and never discharged that.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. Hope everybody had a wonderful holiday. If I haven't seen you since then. Call this press conference today because I believe the people of Alabama deserve an explanation on where things stand and where I stand with regard to capital punishment in our state. A little perspective first. I have stood in many crime scenes, and I have seen the depravity of those who take the life of another. I've sat with victims' families and through their tears heard their stories of heartbreak and of sorrow. I have personally tried, convicted, and successfully advocated for someone to be on death row for the offense of capital murder. And I have likewise heard victim stories after that verdict about how the delay in the implementation of the death sentence impacts them for years to come. That's why I stand before you today to be very clear. Insofar as I and my office are concerned, there is no moratorium, nor will there be, on capital punishment in Alabama. What occurred on November 17th was a travesty, but not for the reasons that many death penalty opponents and death row sympathizers would have the public to believe. It was a travesty of justice not for Kenny Smith, the twice convicted murderer who was scheduled to be executed that day, but it was for Elizabeth Sennett and for the members of her family. 35 years. That's how long Elizabeth Sennett's family waited for justice to occur. 35 long years. To give some perspective, almost half of Alabama's population wasn't even born when this malicious crime was committed. The well-known axiom is true, that justice delayed is justice denied. And the clear record is that the delay relating to these executions lies at the feet of the inmates and their lawyers and not the state of Alabama. Let's take Mr. Smith's execution as an example. On the day of that execution, our team was in 3 separate courts defending the frivolous claims of his lawyers, ultimately obtaining the victory at the United States Supreme Court, but 4 hours after that execution was scheduled to defend. Our office had to defend and win that case 35 years after this crime was committed. Unfortunately, as has been widely publicized, the Department of Corrections was unable to carry out that sentence before the death warrant expired. There's been a great deal of media coverage, both local and national, about what happened in Kenny Smith's execution chamber. Much of that coverage has seemingly been openly sympathetic to Smith and his cause, even with some going so far as to advocate for the abolishment of the death penalty. And on what basis exactly? Because a cold-blooded convicted killer complains about the prodding and poking of a small Ivey line. Really? Prodding and poking with a needle? Let's consider the awful irony of Smith's complaints. He is the monster convicted of the murder of a woman who was stabbed 10 times with a 6-inch survival knife. And then she was beaten and bludgeoned to the point that her face was unrecognizable to her family and to her friends. Elizabeth, a God-fearing woman and mother, suffered 8 stab wounds to her chest, 1 to each side of her neck, and her face was smashed with a fireplace poker. And yet some want to complain that the use of a small IV needle somehow or another violates the Constitution. In Alabama, we acknowledge that there are some crimes that are so heinous, atrocious, and cruel, so depraved, that the only just punishment is death. Kenny Smith, like Alan Miller before him, succeeded in only postponing, not escaping, that just punishment. Over the last few weeks, I've seen some pronouncements that somehow or another we have a so-called moratorium on executions in Alabama. And I will tell you that that characterization came as a great surprise to me, because there's only two parties involved in setting an execution in Alabama. That's me as Attorney General and our Alabama Supreme Court. Whether before or after that execution, the governor is given the authority to either commute or reprieve a sentence. We each have our individual lawful responsibilities, and I intend to carry out mine. Moving forward, for victims' families throughout this state, we cannot repeat the result of what occurred on November 17th, when my office worked tirelessly to obtain victories before both the Alabama Supreme Court as well as the United States Supreme Court. And there's absolutely no reason why other capital cases should be similarly postponed. To that end, I trust that Governor Ivey and her team will take all steps necessary to allow the orders of the Alabama Supreme Court to be carried out and justice to be obtained for families throughout Alabama. And let me also end with this. Many of the activists and lawyers and media who lament the state of death row inmates like Kenny Smith are some of the same individuals who nationally have advocated for policies that exacerbate instances of violent crime. It too often ends with the death of both the innocent and the accused. And that irony is not lost on me, prosecutors, law enforcement, and others in this state who care desperately about the safety of our communities. Let me be clear, I stand with the great majority of the people of Alabama in this state. And I will never back down from doing everything in my power to ensure that ultimate justice is served in those cases in which our trial courts have imposed the sentence of death and that our appellate courts have approved. Happy to answer any questions at this time. Yes, ma'am.
The governor, in requesting the review, said she was asking your office to pause seeking execution dates. Are you going along or refusing that request? And when will you seek another execution date?
Well, right now, I intend to have conversations with the governor, welcome that conversation. We would not seek an execution date unless we were confident that, in fact, the execution would be carried out. But I believe that 12 different executions have occurred during my tenure as Attorney General. The state of Alabama has proven successful in being able to do that, and I see no reason why we can't do that here in the near future. Yes, sir.
The governor also said, in her statement, that criminals were gaming the system and preventing these executions from taking place. Is that something that your office is looking into as to preventing people from stopping these executions from taking place?
I'm not sure what she would have meant by gaming the system, but it's clear that part of the legal strategy is to run out the clock. You know, right now we have death warrants that are for a 24-hour period. The Department of Corrections has taken the position that it's 6 hours in which they will allow that to occur. So if you're a defense lawyer representing an inmate, you simply know that you have to push the clock back as far as possible. I think we saw that occur with the last two executions at no fault of the state of Alabama, both of which we prevailed ultimately in the United States Supreme Court. And I'm very proud of the legal team that we have in place that have successfully defended these cases. And let's be mindful here of something else. These are not innocent claims. They're not saying somehow or another that they didn't commit this crime. These were separate claims, different from someone who advocated for their innocence, but instead used those claims as a way of delaying the ultimate punishment. Mike?
The last couple of executions have been delayed by the court proceedings, but there were still 3 hours or so to carry them out. How concerned are you that the state is not able to carry an execution out, in 3 hours or so? And do you think the review is a good idea to figure out how the state can be more efficient?
I have no problem with the review. And the reality is, I look forward to hearing whether or not the governor determines there's anything differently that's been done in the last two that may have impacted why we were not able to complete it before the time ran out. But let's also acknowledge that inmates themselves have responsibility here, not just in the delay that's occurred, but I think you've seen in pleadings that we have where inmates are resisting the efforts to put that IV line in, which obviously makes it more difficult. And so I look forward to hearing the results of that review. But we've been able to do this for quite some time, and I expect us to be able to do it in the future. Yes, sir.
Sir, has the word moratorium been introduced into this conversation, made things more complicated?
I think it's confused people because there is no moratorium in place. What you simply heard was the governor ask for a delay to be able to investigate what could be done better within the execution protocol. And so we look forward to having any conversation with her about that. But at the same time, let's be clear, this needs to be expedited and be done quickly because we have victims' families right now that are asking the question of when we'll be able to seek that next date. I need to be able to give them answers. Yes, ma'am.
Do you think that there should be a device or some machine introduced to the process to find things more easily, since that's been the problem in these last few years?
Yeah, I'm not the person to answer that question. I know there are medical devices that can do that. Whether Department of Corrections has access to that is really a question that needs to be directed at them. So, yes, sir.
In the joint and special motion, I noticed that the state agrees to execute Alan Miller by nitrogen hypoxia. At his pre-execution hearing in federal court, one of your attorneys told the judge there that they felt it was very, very likely that that process would be in place by the time of his execution. It was not. How hopeful are you that that process will be in place soon? And what would you say to the victims of the family members of his victims that their day for justice is coming soon?
Okay. First of all, I'm not sure the characterization of our lawyer's statement is exactly correct, but having said that, I understand that saying that clearly we are moving in that direction. Look, the legislature in 2018 passed the law that allowed this to be an option. And right now, we need to be able to make sure that we can effectuate the intent of the legislature. In fact, it looks right now, a fairly timely decision the legislature made in allowing us to be able to have that option. And our intention, as it has been now for the last several months, is to do everything that we can to do our part in assisting the Department of Corrections and to be able to allow that to be an option moving forward, which will eliminate, obviously, some of the very concerns that we saw with Kenny Smith and with Alan Miller, and to be able to have that additional method available. And again, I look forward to being able to tell victims we have some certainty of where we're going. Yes, ma'am.
Has your office had any communication with the governor's office on this since she
You can only speak to me directly. I've not talked to the governor and look forward to having that conversation with her directly. Yes, sir.
Do you have any pending requests to the Supreme Court to set execution dates?
There are none.
Okay. If I understood you right, you said you were going to have a conversation with the governor before requesting any more, is that?
What I want to make sure is that, number one, that we've given her an opportunity to do this review that she said that she would do, to make sure that I hear from her that there is confidence that we have the ability to execute it. Again, multiple occasions during my tenure as Attorney General, we have done what the courts have authorized, and that is to implement the sentence of death. And I see no reason why we're not going to be able to do that in the future. Yes, sir.
Attorney General, is there anything the state legislature could do, like maybe adding another method of execution or increasing that window to 48 or 72 hours?
Yeah, I don't know that it's a legislative matter as to increasing the 24-hour period. Conceivably, that may be something as a rule of court that we could address. But again, although we have a 24-hour period right now, but really in actuality have a 6-hour window based upon policies the Department of Corrections have in place long before the current commissioner, long before Governor Ivey or myself, and I'm sure that's one of the things that they will look at as part of their review. All right. I'm sorry, Kim, just a second. Let me get in the bag. Can't speak to that. Yes.
Sir, just so I'm clear, the governor's office has asked you not to seek any more dates until she completes this review. Are you going along with that?
Now, I've not spoken to the governor directly. All I've seen is what is listed in the press release itself. So I've seen what you've seen. I know she wants to engage in that review, but I'm also sitting here telling you that we're not going to stand very, very long in a delay when this needs to be a major priority in answering that question.
Is your office in a position to seek any dates imminently or
Can't speak to that, but we could probably supplement you on that occasion. Right now, obviously, we still have continued litigation involving Mr. Miller. Do you get a quota, by the way? Do we need to acknowledge that? Fair enough. I'll hold you to it.
Do you have a time frame estimate on the nitrogen hypoxia?
I'd hate to give you that, Mike. I just know that we are in the final stages of what we need to be able to do. Yes, sir.
Sir, any other states having problems, complications with this process like Alabama right at this time, sir?
Couldn't speak to that. You know, I think, you know, it's well publicized that obtaining medications has been something that states have dealt with, but I couldn't speak to this issue in which we've had for the last two. All right. Yes, ma'am.
So we've had 3 executions that have had to be canceled because of problems with IV access and time concerns. 2 of those inmates ultimately had, Ham and Miller ultimately had lethal injection taken off the table for settlement agreements. Isn't it worth a review to try to get this right? Because
Kim, don't misunderstand me. I've not objected to the review. But what I'm also saying is that there is a timeliness for this to occur. And that's an expectation that we will have as we move forward with this. Now, Dole-Ham is a very unique case, and I think everyone that has followed that knows the circumstances of it. There was a medical condition that made IV access difficult. So I really think Ham is the exception to that. These other 2, it was not a similar situation.
you said that this won't go on indefinitely. Do you have a time frame of how long is reasonable to wait for a review?
Reasonable's in the eye of the beholder, right? I mean, I'm not going to necessarily say that there's a date certain, but again, I look forward to the conversation I have with the governor about this. But to me, there's a very discreet and limited investigation that needs to be able to take place about what is it that could allow the state to better proceed moving forward to make sure that we ultimately do what is our responsibility, is that's to obtain justice for the victims in these cases. And again, I have complete confidence in Governor Ivey and the team to make sure that they can work with the Department of Corrections to figure out what that is so that we can, again, do the jobs that we're required to do as the lawyers for the state of Alabama. So, yes, sir.
Speaking of the review, I know it's the governor's hands basically, but what is your opinion of there being an independent group involved to provide more transparency about the results that review?
Don't see a reason for any independent group to be involved. Now, to the extent the governor needs to consult somebody for any reason, obviously that's her call. But we've proven that we have the ability to do this in Alabama and believe that we will make sure that we get this right and be able to move forward. So, all right, I'm going to leave this last question for you, sir. No pressure, right? Is that right?
With the issue that the DOJ has already had with the prison systems here in Alabama, do you think that this is going to exacerbate that?
This is completely a separate issue involving the litigation in the Department of Corrections. So, all right, thanks everybody for your time.